My son looked at his boss and said, "This is just our housekeeper. We let her stay out of pity. She's good with a mop." In that moment, my chest tightened like it might shatter. I had sold my bakery, buried my dreams, and spent my whole life raising him alone after his father died. I wasn't a maid. I was the reason he stood in that suit, in that office, with that boss. But he stripped me of everything in one sentence. I stayed silent, but his boss's eyes lingered on me. Then he whispered, "Are you sure? Because I know her. I was never meant to be a housekeeper. I was Margaret Holloway, 63 years old, a woman whose hands had carried more flour than most bakers see in a lifetime. Every morning for decades, I rose at 3 a.m. when the world outside was silent and the stars still clung stubbornly to the sky. My body would ache from the day before, but I'd swing my legs over the edge of the bed and whisper to myself, "Get up, Margaret. Dough won't knead itself." The kitchen lights always felt too bright at that hour, but they were my sanctuary. The bakery was small, just a brick front shop with 2 ovens and a faded sign that read, "Holloway's Hearth." My husband, William, had helped me paint the letters the summer before he died. He collapsed on a construction site one hot afternoon, and by evening, I was a widow with a 10-year-old son named Ethan, and debts that gnawed at me like rats in the dark. The bakery was not just bread and sugar, it was survival. I baked to pay the mortgage, baked to cover school clothes, baked so Ethan would never feel the sting of hunger I had once known as a child. Those years were brutal. My body thinned from exhaustion, my fingers cracked from flour and cold water. But when Ethan looked up at me with chocolate smudged across his mouth, I thought, it's worth it. He was my reason for grinding through endless dawns. I told myself every sacrifice was a stone laid on the road to his future. I didn't buy new dresses. I wore the same cardigan for nearly 15 years. I didn't take vacations. I took double shifts. I didn't dream for myself. I dreamed for him. When Ethan turned 17, he announced he wanted to study business at university. I smiled and said, "Of course," though the tuition figures burned holes in my chest. The only way to pay was to sell the ancestral house William had inherited from his parents, the house where he and I had planted rose bushes by the porch, where Ethan had taken his first steps. Signing those papers was like cutting away my last tie to William. Still, I told myself, if Ethan succeeds, then none of this will be in vain. The day Ethan left for college, I watched him board the bus with a suitcase we could barely afford. I stood in the crowd of parents, my apron still dusted with flour, and I clutched my chest as if to keep my heart from falling out. He didn't look back. Perhaps that was youth. Impatience, eagerness, the hunger to leave small towns behind. I waved anyway, even though he never raised his hand. The bakery became quieter after that. Customers still came, mothers with toddlers, men grabbing bread before work. But without Ethan's laughter in the back room, it felt like I was baking for ghosts. I worked longer hours to send money to him. I clipped coupons, pawned jewelry, and one winter when the pipes burst and repairs threatened to drown me, I skipped heating for a week just to make sure Ethan had enough for books. I told myself, this is what love looks like when you're older. You step back so others can move forward, but stepping back has a cost. My knees stiffened, my eyesight blurred, and one December morning I fainted over a tray of scones. The doctor said it was exhaustion. He recommended rest, less work, maybe even retirement. Retirement? For people like me, rest was a myth. Still, I considered it. Ethan was graduating soon. Maybe he would return. Maybe he would take care of me for once. The thought was tender, foolish, but it kept me going. When Ethan finally walked across that graduation stage, I was there in the crowd clapping until my palms burned. He looked handsome in his gown, sharp in a way that reminded me more of William than myself. After the ceremony, I hugged him, pressing my face against his shoulder. "I'm so proud," I whispered. He patted my back lightly, already scanning the crowd for his friends. That night, I went home alone. ate leftover bread for dinner, and told myself his distance was only temporary. Years bled into one another. Ethan climbed quickly in the business world, working long hours, shaking hands with men in suits. Meanwhile, my bakery faltered. Big chains moved into town, and customers chose convenience over tradition. Arthritis crept into my fingers. Eventually, I sold the shop to a younger woman who called me her mentor. People congratulated me on retiring, said I had earned my rest. They didn't know selling the bakery felt like burying myself alive. It wasn't rest. It was erasure. I moved into Ethan's house not long after. "Just for a while," he had said, his voice kind but distracted. "You need a break, Mom." I packed my life into a handful of boxes, photographs, recipes, William's old jacket, and tried to convince myself this was home now. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that my sacrifices would bloom into warmth, that Ethan would look at me and see more than tired hands and fading strength. Most nights, when the house was quiet, I opened an old leather-bound notebook. It was where I kept scraps of recipes, grocery lists, and sometimes fragments of my heart. One page, stained with coffee, held words I had written years earlier but had never shown anyone. If the day comes when my son forgets me, will I still have enough strength to remember myself? That question lingered in the air of that silent room, a whisper too heavy to ignore. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, unaware of how close that day truly was. The night of Ethan's birthday party should have been a celebration. His colleagues, investors, and friends filled the grand hall of a downtown hotel, their laughter bouncing off the marble walls. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting light over tables set with crystal glasses and gold-trimmed plates. I stood near the corner, my dress simple and worn but pressed carefully, a gift from a neighbor years ago. I told myself that tonight I would just be proud. Tonight I would see the fruit of all my years of sacrifice in the man my son had become. When Ethan walked into the room, tall and confident, the crowd erupted in applause. He wore an expensive suit, the kind that made him look as though he had never known hunger or second-hand shoes. My chest swelled despite myself. That was my son, my Ethan. For a brief moment, I forgot the distance that had crept into our relationship, the clipped phone calls, the rushed visits. For a moment, I was just a mother proud of her child. But then the introductions began. Ethan moved from table to table, shaking hands, exchanging practice smiles. When he reached his boss, Howard Whitman, a man I recognized from the business section of the newspaper, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said with an easy laugh, "This is just our housekeeper. We let her stay out of pity. She's good with a mop." The words struck harder than any blow I had ever known. My breath caught. The air in the room thickened, and I felt as though everyone had turned to look at me. Just our housekeeper, out of pity, good with a mop. I had sold my bakery, bled my knuckles raw, buried every dream I had ever owned so that Ethan could stand here in his fine suit. And this was how he named me. I stood frozen, my face betraying nothing, though inside I was splintering apart. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the group, some assuming Ethan was making a light-hearted joke. But Samantha, his wife, smiled a smile sharp enough to cut glass and added sweetly, "Without her, the house would be a disaster. She's useful in her way." Her voice dripped with something that wasn't kindness. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say, "I am not your maid. I am your mother." But my tongue clung to the roof of my mouth. Years of silence, of swallowing pain, pressed me still. Instead, I stared at Ethan, searching his face for a flicker of shame, a sign that he realized what he had just done, but he only adjusted his tie and went on. The conversation shifted as Ethan launched into a polished story about his humble beginnings. He told his boss and colleagues how he grew up with nothing, how he clawed his way into success through sheer determination. He used my presence, the woman he had just labeled a housekeeper, as evidence of his triumph. I went from a household that could barely afford groceries to standing here today, self-made, no handouts, self-made. The word twisted in my gut. Was the roof I kept over his head nothing? Were the nights I baked until my hands bled just so he could eat invisible? Was selling the house William and I built together not a handout, but a betrayal erased by a slick narrative? I could feel eyes on me, some curious, some sympathetic. To them, I must have looked like a tired old woman clutching her handbag, grateful to be included in a room too grand for her. They didn't know the truth, that every corner of Ethan's success was paved by my sacrifices. Howard's gaze, however, lingered. While others laughed at Ethan's performance, Howard studied me with a furrowed brow, his drink forgotten in his hand. For a moment, I wondered if he saw through the illusion, if he could sense the lie wrapped in Ethan's polished words. Samantha leaned closer to Ethan, her hand sliding onto his arm, her laughter chiming like broken glass. "You've done so well for yourself, darling. No one would ever guess where you came from." Ethan nodded, his chest puffing with pride, as if the distance between who he was and who he claimed to be justified the cruelty. I swallowed hard, pressing my nails into my palm to ground myself. In that moment, I remembered a night years ago when Ethan was 6 and came home from school crying because another boy had called him poor. I had knelt down, held his face in my flour-dusted hands, and promised him, "One day, no one will ever make you feel small again." The irony burned my throat. Now it was he who made me small. Howard finally spoke, his voice cutting through the laughter. "Are you sure?" he said slowly, his eyes still fixed on me. The room quieted. Ethan blinked, his smile faltering. "Because I know her." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. My heart pounded so loudly I thought the chandelier above might rattle. Ethan's grip on his glass tightened, and for the first time that evening, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. I lowered my gaze, not ready for what might come next, but inside, a small ember glowed. Howard knew me, and if he knew me, then perhaps I had not been erased entirely. After the party, the silence in Ethan's house was heavier than the glittering noise of that ballroom. I returned with them, still wearing the same dress, my skin sticky with shame that clung tighter than perfume. Ethan barely looked at me. Samantha busied herself with removing her jewelry, humming as though the evening had been a triumph. Not a word of apology passed their lips. Instead, they treated me as if I had been no more than part of the waitstaff, an extra body among the caterers, a ghost who had wandered into photographs but did not belong there. By the next morning, my place in the house had changed. The bedroom I once used was reassigned to guests. And Samantha, smiling with her perfect teeth, told me she had prepared something cozier for me. She led me to a small storage room near the back of the house. Boxes of Christmas ornaments and unused furniture lined the walls, leaving barely enough space for a cot and a narrow dresser. "It's temporary," she said sweetly, as though she were doing me a kindness. I nodded, swallowing the bitter taste rising in my throat. Meals followed the same logic. At breakfast, I found one plate set aside on the counter, separate from the table where Ethan and Samantha ate. They laughed about their schedules, their trips, their plans, while I sat on a stool near the sink, eating scrambled eggs that had already cooled. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself food is food, whether served at the table or in the shadows. But each bite tasted like exile. Days bled into each other. I walked through the house without sound, careful not to intrude, careful not to demand space. I had built a life on sacrifice, and now that sacrifice had devoured me. To Ethan and Samantha, I was no longer a mother, but a burden to be hidden in the corners. One evening, as I carried laundry upstairs, I heard voices drifting from Ethan's study. I paused in the hallway, unseen. "If she signs the property over, we'll have the capital we need," Ethan said, his tone sharp and businesslike. Not the voice of a son, but of a strategist. Samantha replied smoothly, She's old. She doesn't need much anymore. Just keep her comfortable until she agrees. Then it's ours." I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. Property, capital, comfortable. Words that sliced away the last fragile threads binding us as family. I wanted to storm in to remind Ethan that the property he coveted was built on William's sweat and my endless work. But instead, I sank back into the darkness of the hallway, silent. That night, in the cramped storage room, I took out the photo of William I always kept by my bed. His face, frozen in youth, smiled up at me. "William," I whispered, my voice breaking. "If you were here, what would you tell me to do? Would you tell me to fight or to walk away?" My tears blurred the glass, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry like the woman I had been before the world hardened me. The next day brought a crueler discovery. Ethan had left a folder on the kitchen counter, a thick stack of legal documents. Perhaps he thought I wouldn't notice, or perhaps he believed I couldn't understand. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a transfer plan. My name, printed on deeds and accounts, was listed as soon to be reassigned. In his notes, Ethan had written, "Project, consolidate assets. Expectation, inheritance advanced due to maternal decline." Maternal decline. As though I were a business liability, an asset depreciating with time, not a living woman. In his calculations, I was already gone. The paper trembled in my hands. For a moment, despair threatened to crush me, to fold me into the nothingness they had already decided I was. But as I stared at those words, something inside me shifted. My whole life had been about endurance, about giving until nothing was left. And yet, as the ink blurred from the tears that fell on the page, I felt something else stirring. Anger. Not the wild rage of youth, but a steady flame, slow and controlled. I pressed the papers flat on the table, my hands still shaking. My breath came heavy, but my eyes hardened. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt awake. The folder of documents never left my mind. Each night in that storage room that smelled of mothballs and damp wood, I reread the words, "maternal decline," as if repetition could numb their sting. But instead, it sharpened me. My silence was no longer surrender. It was watchfulness. I moved through the house with the quiet of someone planning her escape, not her end. One Saturday morning, the sound of Ethan's voice jolted me from the kitchen. "Howard's coming by," he said to Samantha, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. "Big deal. If I play this right, it could mean a promotion." The name hit me like a sudden gust. Howard Whitman, the same boss who had studied me so strangely at Ethan's party. My heart quickened. I remembered the bakery years ago, the winter storms that had driven families into debt, the desperate faces who came to me for bread they couldn't afford, and one man, younger then, shoulders heavy with failure who I refused to turn away. Could it be the same Howard? The doorbell rang. Moments later, Howard entered, his presence filling the polished living room. His hair was silver now, his suit tailored, but the lines around his eyes spoke of battles fought and won. Ethan greeted him with a practiced grin, launching into small talk about quarterly numbers. Samantha poured drinks, her every move rehearsed. I stood at the edge of the room, as I always did, hoping to pass unseen. But Howard's eyes found me immediately. He paused mid-sentence, the glass in his hand hovering. "Mrs. Holloway?" he said slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan glanced between us, his smile faltering. "Oh, you mean Margaret. She helps around the house." He forced a laugh. "She likes to keep busy." Howard did not laugh. Instead, he set his glass down with care, his gaze steady on me. "No," he said. "This woman is no housekeeper." The room stilled. Samantha's hand froze around the pitcher of water. Ethan shifted uneasily, but Howard pressed on. 30 years ago, when my father's business collapsed, we nearly lost everything. We had creditors at our door, bills we couldn't pay, and mouths to feed. Your bakery, Holloway's hearth, kept us alive. You extended credit when no one else would. You gave bread to my sisters when we couldn't afford a crumb. You gave us dignity when we had none. His voice caught slightly. Without you, Margaret, I would not be standing here today. My chest tightened. Memories rushed back. The weary man with tired eyes, the children clutching loaves of bread with trembling hands, the whispered thanks. I had thought little of it then. It was simply what one did when faced with hunger and need. But here was the man, decades later, giving it weight I had never claimed. Ethan's face blanched, his confident mask cracking. "Howard, you must be mistaken. Howard cut him off, his voice firm. "If you can deny the worth of this woman, Ethan, then you'll lose far more than a promotion. You'll lose my respect. And believe me, in this business, that's everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line, fury and fear mingling in her eyes. Ethan looked at me, but for once he could not meet my gaze. I lowered my head, offering Howard only a faint smile and a small nod. I had no desire to expose my son further, no hunger for vengeance. Recognition had come, but not from where I had once craved it. I did not need Ethan's validation, not anymore. Later that evening, I walked alone to the street where my bakery had once stood. The shop was gone now, replaced by a boutique with spotless windows and sleek displays. Yet when I closed my eyes, I could still smell the yeast, the sugar, the faint char of overbaked crusts. I sat on the curb and let the scent of memory wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt whole, not because someone had honored me, but because I remembered who I had always been. The night air was cool. I pulled my coat tighter and opened my worn leather notebook. My pen scratched against the page as I wrote slowly, deliberately, "I do not need anyone to know, but I will live again. For myself." As the ink dried, I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest. The flame inside me was no longer a flicker. It was steady, strong, and mine. The notebook entry was a promise, and unlike all the promises I had once made to Ethan, this one was to myself. Within a week, I began moving in silence. I withdrew my portion of the assets that still bore my name, careful not to invite Ethan's questions. He and Samantha noticed the missing documents only after it was too late. The lawyer, an old friend of William's, handled everything discreetly. When the transfer was final, I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases. The morning I left, the house was quiet. Samantha was still asleep upstairs, and Ethan sat in the kitchen scrolling through his phone, half awake, a cup of coffee at his elbow. I paused at the doorway watching him. My son, the boy I had raised with calloused hands and sleepless nights, didn't even glance up. My heart ached, but not with longing. The ache was release. "Goodbye, Ethan," I whispered under my breath, though he never heard it. By the time they discovered my absence, I was gone. I left behind the storage room, the cold meals, and the cruel silence. What I carried with me was my freedom. I returned to the part of town where Holloway's hearth once stood. The old shopfront was long sold, but a small vacant building 2 blocks away bore a "for lease" sign. The windows were dusty, the paint peeling, but when I stepped inside, I smelled possibility. Not wealth, not glory, but purpose. I signed the lease that afternoon. This time, the bakery was different. I did not aim for profit or prestige. I aimed for connection. I called it Second Rise. The ovens were small, the tables mismatched, but the doors were open to women like me, women who had given their lives to others and found themselves invisible. Here they could gather. Here their stories mattered. The first week, only a handful came. Widows, grandmothers, women whose children lived in distant cities. They drank coffee, kneaded dough, and shared the pieces of their lives that no one else cared to hear. One woman wept over losing her home. Another confessed she hadn't spoken to her children in years. I listened. I held their hands. I let them be seen, and as I did, I realized I was being seen too. Word spread quietly. Soon more women arrived. Some brought recipes, others brought music, one even taught knitting at the back table. The shop became less a bakery and more a sanctuary. Each morning when I unlocked the door, the air filled with the hum of voices and the smell of bread rising, an orchestra of survival. One afternoon, a young journalist from the local paper stopped by. She had heard whispers of a bakery for forgotten women and wanted to write a feature. I hesitated at first, shy of the attention, but she insisted. She asked me about my past, about Holloway's hearth, about why I started over so late in life. I told her the truth, not about Ethan, not about betrayal, but about resilience. I said, "Sometimes we aren't given recognition. Sometimes we must bake our own." She smiled, scribbling furiously in her notebook. A week later, the article appeared, "Second Rise, a symbol of quiet strength." The front page carried a photo of me, flour dusted on my apron, surrounded by women laughing at the long wooden table. The caption read, "Margaret Holloway proves it's never too late to rise again." I thought little of it until customers began flooding in, not just to buy bread, but to sit, to listen, to belong. They called me inspiring. They said I reminded them of their mothers, their grandmothers, themselves. For the first time in years, I felt not erased but multiplied. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan picked up the paper at his office. He froze when he saw the photograph. There I was, smiling, alive in a way he had never seen me. Samantha leaned over his shoulder, her face paling as she read the headline. Ethan's hand trembled against the page. His lips parted, but only one sentence escaped. That's my mother? The article did more than bring customers to Second Rise. It sparked conversations across the city. Community leaders, church groups, even local officials began visiting, praising the bakery not only for its bread, but for its heart. My name, once spoken only in whispers at the edges of family gatherings, now appeared in speeches and newsletters. To many, I had become a symbol, not because I sought it, but because I lived it. For Ethan, the article was not just an inconvenience. It was a crack in the facade he had built. Howard, his boss, read the feature and said nothing directly, but Ethan noticed the shift. Meetings grew shorter. Trust grew thinner. A man who cannot honor where he comes from cannot be trusted where he's going, Howard said once, almost casually, though the words carried weight. Ethan pretended not to hear, but the sting lingered. At networking events, colleagues who had once admired Ethan now asked about me instead. "Is it true your mother runs that bakery for women?" "Remarkable," they'd say, their smiles warm but their eyes sharp with judgment. Ethan would force a chuckle, mumbling that it was just a hobby of hers. Yet each mention chipped away at the authority he tried so hard to project. Samantha grew restless, her whispers at night turning sharper, her blame pressing down on him like a millstone. I, meanwhile, lived freely for the first time in decades. Each day at Second Rise reminded me that dignity could be baked into a loaf of bread, that laughter could rise like yeast in a warm kitchen. I did not think often of Ethan, though sometimes, in quiet hours, his face surfaced in my mind. Once as a boy with sticky fingers reaching for cookies, now as a man who had lost his way. But I let the thought drift away like smoke. Then came the invitation. The city was holding an event to honor community builders, individuals whose work had strengthened the lives of others. To my surprise, my name was on the list. I hesitated, reluctant to stand in the spotlight, but the women who gathered each week at my bakery insisted. "This is not just for you, Margaret," one said, gripping my hand. "This is for all of us." So I agreed. The evening of the event, the hall shimmered with lights, banners celebrating resilience and service draped across the stage. I wore a simple dress, one of the few I owned, and carried no jewelry save for my wedding band. As I stepped inside, the applause startled me. Not for who I had been to Ethan, but for who I had become to myself. Among the crowd, I noticed him. Ethan stood near the back, stiff in his suit, his eyes fixed on me as though I were a stranger he half recognized. His face was pale, his jaw tense. Samantha lingered at his side, but even she seemed diminished in the glow of the evening. When my name was called, I walked across the stage. The mayor shook my hand, handing me a plaque etched with words I could hardly absorb. The audience clapped, the women from Second Rise cheering loudest of all. And in that moment I saw Ethan step forward, his eyes glistening with something I had not seen in years: regret. Our gazes met. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His shoulders hunched, his pride collapsing inward. I felt the pull of memory, nights in the bakery, his small hands in mine, but I did not let it sway me. Instead, I inclined my head ever so slightly, a nod of acknowledgement, nothing more. Then I turned away. At the foot of the stage, the women I had come to love and cherish reached out for me, their arms wrapped around me, their laughter and tears blending into a chorus of belonging. I stepped into them fully, leaving Ethan behind in the shadows of his own making. The cameras flashed. One photograph captured it perfectly, my smile, gentle, tinged with sorrow, yet radiant with freedom. In that frozen image, I was not a housekeeper, not a burden, not an erased mother. I was Margaret Holloway, whole. And as the lights dimmed and the applause faded, a quiet voice seemed to whisper, not mine, not the mayor's, but the storyteller's voice carried into the hearts of those watching. If one day the person who denied you knelt to beg forgiveness, would you grant it? Or would you, like Margaret, choose silence as your answer? Tell me, what would you do?